This is the Atlas Tour of Water Enhancing Projects, a look at some of the most impactful projects on the ground in the West Texas region. This is a fun session. It is a rapid fire, so put on your seatbelt and hold on. Our moderator today is Robert Potts. Robert's a longtime conservationist of Texas. He is chairman of the board of the Dixon Water Foundation and formerly served as CEO. Prior to that, he spent time as general manager of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and from 93 to 2004, he was with the Nature Conservancy. So please welcome Mr. Robert Potts to the stage.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Potts. I'm with the Dixon Water Foundation. You've heard a little bit about us in the previous session. Casey Wade, who was sitting right here, is the president, and I can't really do a better job than he of telling you about what we do. It's just simply that our mission is improving watershed health through good land management. We operate a couple of research and demonstration ranches around the state, one of them just on the north edge of Marfa. There's going to be a field trip there tomorrow. I think there's still some room. If you'd like to go, you can meet at the ranch just on the north end of Marfa tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then we have another one in North Texas. So that's a little bit about who I am, what we do. But like I said, Casey, I think, did a great job of presenting that a few minutes ago. As Lewis mentioned, this is kind of a little bit of a different pace than what we've been doing today. You've been listening to a lot of complicated, difficult discussions, really at a high level. We kind of wanted to now get down to the ground, look at some projects that are applying the things that we've been talking about all day and around the region. See what's going on around this region, because that in and of itself is very inspiring. We have several really good speakers to talk about that. Each one of these talks is going to be very short, about 6 minutes long. We're not going to have time for questions, but they will all be at the reception afterwards. So if you want to ask them questions at that time, they'd be glad to talk with you about it. So I want to start out by saying we are very fortunate in West Texas to have a really strong group of young professional conservationists coming along. It's one of the real things that gives me hope going forward. And one of those great young conservationists going forward is our first speaker, Price Rumbelow. Price got his bachelor's degree and his master's degree here at Sul Ross. He then went and worked at the National Park Service and then at Texas Parks and Wildlife, and now he works for the Rio Grande Joint Venture.
Thank you, Robert. Alteration to natural riverscapes has caused cascading events that have led to environmental degradation. Statistics show that 70% of avian species depend on riparian habitat, and 40% of all birds in the Southwest are riparian obligates. The riparian area is the bank of the river, by the way. Riverscapes is another term used, and only 2% of riverscapes in the contiguous U.S. are in relatively pristine condition, unaltered by human activity. Often this alteration comes in the form of decreased structural complexity. Structural starvation can be a direct cause of degradation, as well as a consequence of land use changes. This begs the question of when and what alterations were seen in the Trans-Pecos Chihuahuan Desert. In 1854, Fort Davis was established as an outpost to protect the San Antonio-El Paso Road. Following the Civil War from 1867 to 1891, the fort became a major installation with more than 100 structures and more than 400 soldiers. It just so happens that the distance from the fort at Fort Davis is only 4 miles from the project site. And so it would have been a direct cause of degradation through timber harvest, and maybe more importantly, a catalyst for land use change. The Chihuahuan grasslands have been producing cattle as well as sheep and goats since the second half of the 1500s, with some single producers boasting herds in the tens of thousands by the end of the century. But it was in 1860s that Milton Favor established a ranch on Cibolo Creek in the vicinity of Cienega Mountains, and this was the first recorded Texas cattle owner in what is now Big Bend Ranch State Park. The well-documented and dramatic increase in settlement and economic development by European immigrants following the Civil War was aided significantly by the completion of the railroad. And in 1882, the Southern Pacific arrived in Alpine. The Studi Butte Mining Company opened in 1902, 20 years later, and records show that over a 3-year period, 2,522 cords of firewood was purchased for the kilns. So that is about the time frame that we are looking at. 120 to 170 years ago, the Trans-Pecos opened to increased settlement and extractive use. What does this lead to? Generally speaking, logging riverscapes decreases their natural mechanisms for coping with flooding, and unmanaged grazing leads to increased runoff and reduced recruitment of long-lived large riparian species. Now let me take a second to unpack that livestock statement. Livestock, like wildlife, are typically limited by 3 things: food, water, and cover. When grazing occurs without guidance, a managed system can be something else entirely, but in an unmanaged system, livestock will follow the path of least resistance and seek to establish a home range with easy access to all 3. When I was working for Texas State Parks, I saw this pretty clearly. Wild cattle have reduced recruitment in cottonwoods and willows for about 40 years along a portion of Alameda Creek. It's pretty obvious if you know what you're looking for. There are still plenty of old, mature trees, but almost no young or mid-story trees. Okay, I digress. When logging and reduced recruitment combined, it led to areas with fragmented riparian forests where sediment is exported out of the system faster than it can accumulate, and this leads to downcutting and decreased riparian aquifer storage. One way of addressing this broken hydrology is with filter dams. These structures slow water, decreasing scour and trapping sediment, actually reversing the trend and raising the floor of the channel. The increased time that the water spends on the surface does really neat things to the water below the surface as well. As the riparian aquifer fills, the base flow increases. The water output remains the same roughly. You can't get more out of the system than went in, but instead of the flows all occurring at once, they're spread out over time. And what is really neat is that the restored riparian aquifer can be tapped by riparian vegetation, which will in time supply the woody debris to the system that will eventually do the work of brush weirs, increasing structural complexity naturally. The La Cienega project is a water harvesting project designed to hold water on the landscape and to increase natural storage of water on the La Cienega's property so that return flows occur over a longer time frame. The La Cienega's property is just west of the town of Fort Davis and along Cienega Creek, an intermittent creek which is a tributary of Limpia Creek, ultimately carrying on to the Pecos and then to the Rio Grande. Untreated posts were used to provide the structure, and juniper cut during a thinning project was the material that was weaved through the posts, creating sediment filters. These structures are placed in the straighter portions of the creek, outside of the bends, and perpendicular to flow. First, you have to place the posts. A skid steer with an auger bit to dig the holes for the posts, and a pneumatic or hydraulic post pounder they work really well for placing these posts. Then local vegetation can be used, like cottonwood branches, willow branches, in this case juniper branches, and some cut baccharis. It is woven, stuffed, jumped on to get it down in between the posts up to a height of about 18 inches. Working with a crew, this project was averaging $35 per foot for these brush weirs. To put that into context, the going rate is about $70 per foot. And so if you're encountering a similar situation, I'd encourage you to reach out. Don't wait till the problem gets worse. Low-tech processes can provide a framework for resilient restoration long-term.
Thank you, Price. Our next speaker is Scott Moorhead. He oversees Texas Water Trade's programming and strategic initiatives. He has worked in resource planning for many years, both in the for-profit sector and the non-for-profit sector with the Ben Barnes Institute, and most recently, I think, with Audubon. So, Scott?
Hey everybody, can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm Scott Moorhead. I'm with Texas Water Trade. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. We work all over the state, and really our animating way of working is we're focused on voluntary and market-driven opportunities and solutions to help Texas and Texans manage our water for now and for our water future. And so today I'm here to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing around the Fort Stockton area in the Comanche Springs area. As I said, we work all over the state. This is a great project and just a great series of things that we're working on with partners. I'm excited to share it with you here today. You know, the Comanche Springs complex was well known to, I think, a lot of folks. Once upon a time, it was a very large springs complex, maybe the 5th or 6th largest in Texas. And, you know, flowed at, around 40 CFS a century ago. And today it's really an intermittent springs complex. It shows up in the late winter months for sometimes a few weeks at a time. But, you know, the work that I'm talking about today really started kind of what Senator Perry was talking about earlier, with a vision or a question, and then a commitment to resources, which was what would happen if we could bring it back, or what would be needed to bring it back. It was really kind of the starter question. And so a few years ago, Texas Water Trade started to ask that question with the help of folks like Professor Mace and the Meadows Center, to really understand what kinds of science and economic questions should be asked, if you were to think about that revitalization. And so we looked, as we're wont to do, we're focused on ways to incentivize this behavior, right? A carrot, not a stick. And so we started to look at the different kinds of tools that could be brought to bear, whether that's crop switching from water-intensive row crops in the management zone that contributes to the springs, or irrigation efficiencies. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. Some of them cost more than others. And so we got to a point where we began to kind of work with the partners out in the management zone, maybe metering wells. And in this particular project, we began to work with one of the permittees in the management zone in the contributing area, Belding Farms. It's the second largest pecan farm in the state of Texas. It's about 2,100 acres, and they said, what you guys are thinking about is interesting. We'd be interested in talking to you guys if you want to talk to us, and we can see if there's a community of interest around your goals and also our objectives. And so my organization began to talk with theirs and arrive at a set of ideas that might help them achieve their goals for the farm and for their management, and also work towards reducing demand on that contributing zone that could then potentially show up in springs expression at Comanche Springs. And so about in May of 2022, the parties reached an agreement where the producer and Belding Farms said, here's what we'll do. You help us cost share. We'll start a small pilot. You help us cost share conversion of some of our flood irrigation into a high-efficiency sprinkler system, and we'll look to see how that impacts our production and our quality and our quantity. And if we can make the numbers work, we'll agree to commit whatever water savings are generated from this pilot project to remain in place, in other words, remain in the contributing zone of the aquifer for a period of 15 years. And so if this works, then we'll be willing to talk to you guys about what expanding that pilot could look like. But let's just kick the tires on that and see if we can figure out if and how this would work, and really what the numbers tell us about how impactful this kind of switch from flood irrigation to high-efficiency sprinklers is. And I think that when the project started, maybe even today, Management Zone 1 is still about 50% flood irrigation, so there's room for improvement potentially in the management zone. And so this was really a fantastic opportunity to work collaboratively with a partner who said, we have our objectives, but they're not necessarily asynchronous with yours. Let's figure out how to make this work. And so that pilot began, and fast forward, we're now in January of 2024, and we have effectively almost 2 years of data, and the results are really encouraging. I don't know much about pecans, that's their job, But you have off years and you have on years in pecans, and so you have to look for different things in terms of production yield and quality and quantity. But in both cases, we're seeing significant reductions in water that's needed to irrigate this pilot, which is about a 100-acre unit, compared to controls. So you've got reduced water demand, you've got reduced energy costs to lift that water out of the aquifer. And we're also seeing things like changes in the soil health. So you've got that critical zone between the top of the root and then the bottom of the root, and we've got a reduction of salts in that zone, anywhere from say 25% to 48%, whether that's calcium, sodium, soluble salts. So from their perspective, they're seeing a future opportunity to maybe impact the long-term viability and the health of their soils. This is really exciting. So we may have an opportunity at this point. We've got to continue to study the numbers, continue to study the data, but we may be able to expand what has been a small pilot and potentially bring that up to the entirety of the farm. So we're excited to continue working with them, see what's possible, but we think it's a really great example of how working collaboratively and in tandem with the producer, trying to meet their needs, we may have an opportunity to really protect and promote the resiliency of a shared resource. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So today we've been hearing a lot about the interaction between surface water and groundwater. Our next speaker is a hydrologist that is working in this field. She's up and coming. You're going to hear a lot from her over the next few decades. She's a hydrologist at the Southwest Research Institute. Her name's Rebecca Nunu.
Thank you so much, Robert. Before I get started, closer. Oh, God. Thank you. Before I get started, I just want to thank our conference organizers who have brought us all here together today. I would say it's been a grand success and it's not even over. And I'm really honored to be a part of it. So thank you so much. My recent work on water in the desert has focused on characterizing the sources of recharge that feed San Solomon Springs. You've likely heard of Balmorhea State Park, which is pictured here from one of our sampling campaigns. To hydrologists, this is also known as San Solomon Spring, and it is the most iconic of 6 springs that are located in Balmorhea. It's so iconic that collectively these 6 springs are known as the San Solomon Spring system. And so we've talked a lot about this today. Surface water is really quite limited in this desert region of Texas. So groundwater is pretty much all of these desert communities can rely upon to meet recreational, municipal, and agricultural needs. Protecting these waters requires that we pinpoint the areas that recharge springs like San Solomon so that we can better assess how stressors like drought or increased pumping may impact the quality or quantity of spring flow at San Solomon Springs and other iconic water resources in the area. Geochemistry is a really powerful tool that we can use to help with effective water resource management. We can tell the age of the water, if there's mixing occurring, the rocks through which these waters have flowed, and if there's the addition of byproducts from man-made or human activities. And a geochemical framework, which is what I use in my research, is essentially a streamlined approach that we can use to collect, analyze, interpret, and report on our geochemical data. So I've worked alongside my colleague, Dr. Ron Green, since 2019 on the San Solomon Spring system to collect geochemical data from the 6 springs in Balmorhea and from multiple wells, from multiple aquifers, and numerous counties in the area. And specifically, our goal has been to better understand if there are multiple or different local or regional sources of recharge to this iconic spring system. So to summarize the extensive work we've done in the area since 2019, I'll share that we've identified essentially 4 different sources of both local and regional recharge to the springs. So these springs are predominantly fed by a regional flow system that starts 50 miles away in Culberson County. These waters are 15 to 20,000 years old, and they flow along faults and fractures from Culberson County to the springs, which are in Reeves and Jeff Davis counties. Most springs and wells have very similar iconic or geochemical assemblages, which can be attributed to this regional source of flow, but there are a number of locations that stand out geochemically. So 2 springs, East Sandia and West Sandia Spring, have elevated total dissolved solids and nitrate. So essentially they're saltier, and they likely have some sort of input from man-made activities in their waters. And we think this may be attributed to local recharge from irrigation return flow or precipitation. There's another spring in Balmorhea, Saragossa Spring, that has a very consistently different geochemical assemblage that's likely fed from the surface. And the hydrochemical assemblages of local recharge from rain events that is captured in these springs highlights a 4th important source of local recharge, and that's from rain events. So from a water resource management perspective, it's important to recognize that the sources of recharge to the springs span across multiple counties and multiple jurisdictions. We talked about this morning. We have 3 groundwater conservation districts and 2 groundwater management areas that are all within the capture zone of recharge to this iconic spring system. On top of that, there is a large swath of Culberson County that does not have a designated GCD. So this is a classic example of how aquifers and hydrologic systems do not honor or follow political boundaries as neatly as we would like. And so the findings of our research highlight the importance of these regulatory groups to work together so that they can extend the viability of these precious water resources in West Texas. So in summary, it's no surprise that the San Solomon Spring system is also known as the oasis in the desert. 4 different flow components, both local and regional, are identified in our research by the application of a geochemical framework. In order to protect this precious resource, it's crucial that we know where its sources of recharge are located so that our groundwater districts and other regulatory groups know where their focus should be. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and thank the numerous groups and entities out in West Texas that have made this work possible. The Horizon Foundation, Reeves County Groundwater Conservation District, Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District, the Nature Conservancy, Big Bend Conservation Alliance, Texas Water Development Board, and so many more. Thanks for your support, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Rebecca. One of the things we've been talking a lot about today is how to make sure that there's water getting to all the people that need the water. And our next speaker has been working on this in Presidio County since 2020. Rogelio Rodriguez is the president and Texas director for the Water Finance Exchange. The Water Finance Exchange is a nonprofit organization that works with government, finance, community, all sorts of different folks to bring water to historically underserved areas. So, Rogelio?
So earlier in the program, there was a discussion about funding, and the legislators that were up here, Senator Perry and Representative Tracy King, talked about all the funding that the state put together. And there's also IIJA funding that came about in 2020. So there's just an incredible amount of dollars out there for all of these projects. So Water Finance Exchange operates kind of in that area of the federal government has money, the state has money, but how do you bring that money into communities for projects, and how do you get those projects ready for funding? So it's very much what happened in Presidio County. So in Texas, as was discussed earlier, if you look at the landscape, There are hundreds of water systems that are just incredibly small, and they can't afford the infrastructure that they need to bring safe, reliable, sustainable water to their connections, right? So you can't keep putting infrastructure dollars on top of infrastructure dollars into these small water systems because it just becomes unaffordable. So how do you implement something in a region that provides resilience, sustainability, and get some projects done? Presidio County is a great example of that. Back a couple of years ago, Presidio County was very interested in addressing their water system needs, addressing resiliency needs, green infrastructure, riparian infrastructure for their entire county. It includes Marfa, the city of Presidio. It includes colonias, unincorporated areas that have never had water. So they got together in a regional cooperation and collaborative way led by the county. This presented a lot of challenges, right? It's the first of its kind. It's incredibly unique. They put together a 38-member steering committee that represented every one of those smaller communities so that every project would be heard, every project would be considered, and there would be equity built into the project planning. From that, they created a capital plan, a capital improvement plan that laid out every project they wanted to do, what was important to them, in what community was that project, and what would be the ultimate impact. And so from that, they started applying for funding. What we found out is that there's a lot, it takes a lot, right? So there is an administrative component, there is a procedural component, there are legal components that all have to come together in order for that project planning and that funding to work. And so the county represents a unique model for bringing regional support and reliable water. Some of these entities, some of these smaller communities are very disadvantaged, right? So they needed, and they had their own plans and capital plans that they wanted to achieve. Some of them were just infrastructure repairs, right? Water pipes, water pumps, water lines. The Groundwater Conservation District, Trey Gerfers, got involved, and Trey has been leading that charge for the last couple of years. I saw Commissioner Beebe here. He's been very instrumental in making sure that the county's doing everything they need to do. So ultimately, the legal structure had to be put in place, right? So there had to be a legal structure that allowed the county to be able to fund all these projects. So now, after 2 years, the county's been able to secure a little over $40 million, or they're on the way to securing a little over $40 million in Texas Water Development Board funding. They've jumped through tremendous amount of hoops to be able to plan and make sure that every one of these smaller water systems, every one of these colonias, has the ability to execute these projects, right? They're working with outside consultants. They put together just a tremendous team to make sure that all of the funding and all of the projects get the proper attention. So this is going to be a several-year project, and it's going to address a lot of different things. There's green infrastructure in there. There is rain catchment in there. And ultimately, the county is going to decide its own destiny, given all of the projects and all of its smaller communities, what's important to them individually and collectively. They took into consideration resiliency, sustainability, their water supply, as well as data and monitoring, because all of that was incredibly important in order to map out their future for water. There's been a lot of partners involved, right? This unique regional collaboration was spurred on by EDF and the Water Finance Exchange early on with Trey Gerfers and the county judge at the time really wanting to come up with answers. And so now where they are is they've got a plan, they've got a structure, they've got funding, and now they're executing and all that. But I would be remiss if I didn't sit here and point out Trey Gerfers, point out Commissioner Beebe for all the hard work that they've done to make this go forward. EDF, Water Finance Exchange, we served as catalysts, we served as idea generation, we also served as kind of help along the way, but really they've done the work day in and day out to make these projects, to bring these projects to fruition. Still a lot to go, But that 38-member steering committee that you see there, they gave their opinion on every single project, and every single project was deemed important, whether it was first-time water access, whether it was repairing a levee, or whether it was, I just need some pipes and pumps.
Thank you. So you don't have a conversation about conservation in West Texas for very long without the name Billy Tarrant coming up. Billy is the he's the Associate Director of Stewardship Services at the BRI currently. But before that, he was with Texas Parks and Wildlife for 23 years in the Wildlife Division. Please welcome Billy.
I can't say grace in 5 minutes, so let's see if I can get through this all right. Appreciate this opportunity. While we're on the subject of, and we've heard it all day today about slowing water down and the opportunities to give landowners some incentives, some help in helping them reach their management goals. My presentation is going to be basically on the the big opportunities they may have out there to work with our conservation partners and ourselves to make those things a fruition. So, starting as quickly as we can with the biggest dog in the room, and that's NRCS. Originally the Soil Conservation District, now the NRCS. Hopefully everybody in here is familiar with them. They do great work. Not only do they provide funding for individuals, for projects, for brush management, fence replacement, water distribution, etc. They also provide funding to other partners, which I'll talk about in a minute. And they do have extremely qualified staff to help with technical assistance in implementing those projects, helping them with their stewardship goals. Next, over here on the right is the Partners for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Partners for Fish and Wildlife from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Several years back, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recognized that this incentive-based voluntary conservation works, and it works well. And they started their own program. Once again, they have their own biologists that get out there and work with landowners on those projects. But they also provide funding through certain organizations to help their staff get projects on the ground as well. Down here in the right-hand corner, this is an organization, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They were set up through the U.S. Congress. However, they are actually they're not government employees. They have the opportunity to work across the United States on millions of dollars worth of projects. The ones that really impact us, the biggest one that impacts us the most out here is their Pecos Watershed Conservation Initiative. And we've expanded that into several of our grasslands, and several entities, including even our local soil and water conservation districts and others, have received funding for them, that they work with their landowner partners to get that work out on the ground, primarily focusing on riparian restoration and, once again, grassland restoration for the benefit of our wildlife species. Texas Parks and Wildlife is another great partner that we work with on several projects. They have a program called the Landowner Incentive Program. It uses different funding sources that goes through them, that goes out typically through either their inland fisheries folks that do a lot of stream restoration work, or to the Wildlife Division, and a lot of our biologists out here for Parks and Wildlife have implemented projects through that funding source as well. They also have their own funding that they put out to partners. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The Rio Grande Joint Venture, Jeff Bennett, you heard him earlier, and then Price Rumbelow as well. They're our partners on a lot of projects. I'll try to catch those if I have time. Their focus is on birds. Almost every square inch of the United States and most of North America is covered by a joint venture that were originally set up for waterfowl conservation, but now they've gone all birds. So whenever they do their work, they typically have to have a avian benefit, which is pretty easy to come by out here for with grassland and riparian restoration. Finally, Borderlands Research Institute that I work for now, our Center for Land Stewardship and Stakeholder Engagement. I head that team up. We've got a great team. We're working with our other partners to get conservation on the ground through several different sources. Point being that Rio Grande Joint Venture and Borderlands Research Institute are not typically funders. We don't have the money until it gets to us from another source. That source can be any one of these partners up here. We have a multifaceted partnership called the Greater Big Bend Conservation Partnership, primarily in 3 counties, Jeff Davis, Presidio, and Brewster. That's a large grant from the NRCS. We also it has a a permanent conservation portion of it, or the agricultural conservation easement program through NRCS that we work with our partners at Texas Ag Land Trust, that you heard from Clay earlier, to do permanent conservation plus land work on the land with our partners. I failed to mention the NRCS's programs real quick. The most important one that they do most of the work on is Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That's the one that gets a lot of work done across this region. The Conservation Easement Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. Those are the three big ones that they use through the NRCS offices. Those monies are also available to us, like I mentioned, through our RCPP. We also have a Alameda Creek Conservation Initiative. I think Jeff may have mentioned that earlier as well. That's with Rio Grande Joint Venture and Borderlands Research Institute, working with and through funding from the Horizon Foundation and the Dixon Water Foundation to stand up the capacity to put some of these funds back out in that watershed on Alameda Creek. Very excited about that. And then we also have the Trans-Pecos Grasslands and Riparian Conservation Initiative. Big a pot of money from Pittman Robertson funds, which are excise tax funds that come from the sale of sporting goods, firearms and ammunition. Obviously, that has been a flush the last 20 years, and a lot of state conservation agencies that get that money, like Parks and Wildlife, need to get it back out on the ground for conservation work. We've got a big chunk of money coming to Rio Grande Joint Venture and BRI to try to work with our conservation partners with those funds as well. We also have some at BRI. We also have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners funds coming to us, trying to get that on an annual basis, putting that back out on the ground. Rio Grande Joint Venture just received a large grant from America the Beautiful Act to do the same work, all conservation-based, all incentive opportunities for landowners. No regulatory nexus other than just getting the work done and helping landowners meet their conservation goals. And as you can tell, it's a complicated web, but we all work together. And I think as well as anywhere in the state, we work together out here. So appreciate your time. Thank you. Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Billy. You can see there's lots of opportunities, lots of things that he's got going on. Our next speaker is Dan Mueller. He is Senior Manager with the Environmental Defense Fund, who of course is one of the instigators of this meeting today. He's a registered professional engineer with over 40 years of experience in water resource assessment, management, and policy. He's going to talk to us today about something we've been talking about a lot today, produced water.
Great, thank you. So yes, let's talk about produced water. It's already been mentioned a few times today already. Number one, far west Texas, sitting right here in the Permian Basin, the largest oil and gas producing area in the U.S., one of the largest in the world. What that means is that there's a lot of oil and gas wells. Produced water that comes up out of the well along with oil and gas reserves, there's a lot of it. Mentioned today, there's like 2 to 4 more or even more barrels of water that come up with every barrel of oil. So how is that water managed now? Vast majority of that water is managed in disposal wells, which means there's a lot of disposal wells in this area. But people are thinking more about, should that really, are there better ways to manage that? Well, number one is that, there's a lot of water, and there's this issue with seismic that is occurring on scene that causes some concern about these injection wells. Also, this is an arid part of the country. Is there a better way to use that water? Well, there is a really better way, and that is to use that produced water to fracture other wells, taking the pressure off of other water resources. It takes a lot of water to fracture or to complete other oil and gas wells. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's a great way to use that water, maximize that all that you can, and just use that water to fracture the wells. But at a certain point in time, a couple of things. Number one is that more produced water is generated in an area that can be used for fracturing other wells. And at a certain point in time, a well field gets fully developed, there still is produced water being generated, and that has to be managed some other way, or at least managed some way. So the eyes are turning toward, well, how about doing something else with that water, beneficial reuse, something you're using outside oil and gas operations, cleaning that water up to a higher level. Well, that has challenges. Number one is that this is a very high salinity water. Typically in the Permian Basin, 2 to 4 times the salinity of seawater, sometimes even greater than that. So very saline water. Makes it difficult to treat. But it's more than just the salinity that's in that water. There's other chemicals in that water too that must be treated. That was mentioned earlier today as well. So it's a challenge for both from the science as well as the technology about cleaning that water up to a higher level. Because many of those chemicals that are in this produced water, we actually don't have information about as far as the toxicity or even the ability of the treatment technologies to treat that. There's designs that say it should treat it. We need to prove up that it can. So those are challenges that are being faced as it moves forward. But there's work being done to narrow these knowledge gaps and to work towards what are solutions to maybe use this water in other ways. You mentioned the research consortiums that have been formed. The New Mexico Research Consortium is now entering its 5th year. The Texas Research Consortium is in its now 3rd year. And in those efforts, they're starting to look at pilot projects, to look at these technologies that should be able to treat that water. But how well does it treat it? What's the cost for treating it? Can it reliably treat that water? And can we narrow these science gaps around water constituents of concern? And progress is being made on that, but it takes time to do that. The New Mexico Consortium, is entering its 5th year. It's just now starting to roll out these pilot projects. And so it's taken a while to do that. And the pilot projects are very few, but they are starting to roll out and hopefully be getting some good information about what treatment processes, what are their capabilities, and what are the limitations as far as robustly treating this water to maybe use it for something else. That something else could be for irrigation, that something else could be used for other industrial processes, or even possibly discharge into rivers and streams, kind of augmenting that flow. But these processes, these pilots it's treating this water is difficult. So the pilots have been very slow to get going, but they are getting started. And so there is kind of a light at the end of the tunnel where there's work is progressing to kind of see in the real world conditions how these treatment processes can work. The Texas Consortium, as I say, is also moving forward. And it's also just now getting into the pilot projects and looking at the treatment capabilities of the treatment processes for this water. And it's not just the consortiums. There's work going on as far as industry-led projects. There's academia continuing to work on this, as well as these collaborative efforts. To say the consortiums are a collaborative effort, involve both industry, academia, regulatory groups, and ourselves, environmental groups, all working collaboratively to narrow these knowledge gaps to kind of come up with answers to some really critical questions. So I kind of end this by saying that these are challenges, but there are groups that are working on this in a very methodical way, but it takes time, and it really takes the time to get the science right, to get the good, defensible science so that we feel confident as we move forward to ramping these processes up from a smaller pilot scale system to a larger system. I say that it's just not there yet, but the positive side of that is that there are some really smart people working on it, and as this moves along, we are starting to narrow those gaps and really come up with what will be answers to maybe what are the best ways to use this water other than putting it down disposal wells. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Our next speaker is one of the experts in freshwater conservation statewide. He has been with the Nature Conservancy of Texas for over 20 years and is head of their freshwater program. Ryan Smith.
All right, great. Thanks, Robert. Well, what I'm going to do today is talk to you very briefly about 2 more places on our Atlas tour of water in the desert, and also specifically the tour of what these conservation partners that you've been hearing from today are doing to meet some of the challenges related to water in the desert. So first, I'm going to talk to you about, on the left here, this is the Lower Pecos River, which has a very similar story to what Dr. Vanzik described this morning related to the Rio Grande, which is a river that's had a lot of impacts, undergone a lot of challenges, and is reinvigorated when it meets up with a very nice, vigorous supply of fresh groundwater in the form of the Everett's Trinity. So the lower part of the river in Terrell, Valverde, Pecos County, really starting around Ira Ann, but particularly when it gets to Independence Creek, Live Oak Creek, and a lot of the springs in those counties, that river is reinvigorated and and looks like this. And talk about water in the desert, this is a place where humans have relied on it for thousands of years, literally. Some of the earliest Texans, some of the earliest cultures in this area, and also a place with deep ranching heritage, deep-rooted connection to the land, which I think, as we've heard numerous times over the day, that's one of the reasons why we still have this river and we still have this in relatively intact landscape, is the stewardship of these heritage ranchers. And I'm sorry, I cannot resist telling a little bit of a personal story here too. If I was going to have a second slide, it would be a picture that some of y'all have seen, but of my youngest daughter pouring her head in her snorkel underwater in one of the springs in here. Because this is the place where I've been able to give my kids the first experience of water and show them what a spring is, show them what an aquifer is, where they've caught their first bass in this area. So it's a special place to me personally. The Conservancy has been engaged here for a number of years, but there's been a renewed interest among a variety of partners, some new landowners, also a lot of our conservation partners. You saw dots on Dr. Jaskowicz's map of where Parks and Wildlife is engaged. So for the last 6 months or so, with the support of the Horizon Foundation, some staff from the Conservancy and Parks and Wildlife, and led and cat-herded by Julie Louie, if you all know Julie, in an effort to take a fresh look at what are the things that we deeply care about in this region, including the ecosystems, the cultural heritage, those things. What are the challenges, and what can we do to meet those? What do we need to learn more about, and how the river's connected to the aquifers, and also not if, but how we bring some of these practices, like we heard about in the water stewardship, in the land and water stewardship session. How do we bring these incentive-based programs to, in this area it's really grazing, but keep the producers producing while stewarding the resource even better. And also bringing some of the types of creative partnerships with producers that Scott talked about, potentially to this area as well. So we've been working on this plan for about 6 months and engaged a lot of stakeholders, and maybe at next year's conference we can report out on that a little bit. Okay, the second place on the right, and it's just bigger because of the orientation, not because it's more important, but this is Diamond Y Spring, on our Diamond Y Spring Preserve in Pecos County. And so this is in the same county, the same area as we heard about Comanche Springs, and there's some other springs that have been impacted by water development, but also by some of the challenges we heard about this morning about changes or the climate weirding or whatever, reduced precipitation. But this is a story not of a major spring in terms of volume, but a critically important one because it's persisted through that for the most part. And part of that is because it's a really interesting case study of what Dr. Mace, Dr. Urbanzik talked about this morning, just the juxtaposition of the land surface with the aquifers, and in this case, the spring's occurring in an area of faulting where there's interplay of 3 or more, however many aquifers in this zone, and that's part of what created it, part of what I think has protected it against some of these factors that have affected other springs, but also each of those aquifers from the little thin part of the Pecos alluvium to the Everett's Trinity, Rustler, maybe Capitan Reef too. Each one of those carries its own challenges. This is one of the only ways you can take a picture of the spring from above without actually seeing the oil production going on around it. So it's right in the middle of an oil field, so it's always had its unique challenges. But this spring, the main Diamond Y spring has actually ceased flowing for the first time 2018 and has ceased flowing for a portion of each summer since then. It's the first time that any of us know of. Fortunately, downstream a little bit, maybe about halfway through the picture, there's another spring named after a lot of our good friend John Cargis. We call it Cargis Spring. That spring is still flowing, but we've begun to see impacts here. So we've been working with the Middle Pecos Groundwater District and Parks and Wildlife Department, a variety of other partners, to try and understand what's going on, how the seems like the big culprit here may be depressurization of the Rustler Aquifer, perhaps due to production for fracking to the west of here. But a lot to be worked out, and then also how to use that in these kinds of interventions to ameliorate those effects. And it's also a critical place because anytime you have water in the desert, the species are of importance, and we only have 7 endangered species in the spring, so it's got a lot of complicated things going on here, but trying to think about how to make some interventions to not have this just be a good documentation of the death of another spring, but keep this flowing with whatever kinds of interventions we need to do. And I will end there.
Thank you, thank you, Ryan. So that's just a sample of some of the on-the-ground work that's happening throughout this region. So let's give all of our speakers another round of applause. Thank you.